Welcome everyone to Rapture Saturday. Yeah, I just got the text. My dear UFO friends outside my window are about to take me up. So we have to possibly try to finish this in about 20 or so minutes. Now, what we have today is a massive amount of balance tuning coming next reset. So in basically 3 days, we are getting more tuning, which we haven't gotten in a few weeks. We actually wondered in our last couple of videos about the news for 11.0.7, how we still had no balance tuning in the past 3 weeks. Well, we are about to get it. So, talking about the balance tuning changes, we have to, of course, start alphabetically, which is also arguably the least relevant of the changes, which is the one to Blood Death Knight. Blood Death Knight, Blizzard says, oops, sorry, we kind of nerfed Frost Death Knight and their Deathbringer hero talent, and we also nerfed you. And then a month later, they are like, that was kind of not necessary. So they are buffing Deathbringer back for Blood DK. These are the buffs given to Exterminate and to pretty much all of Reaper's Mark, including Wave of Souls. The total is about a 5% or so damage increase. Now, you might be wondering, hold on a second, what I read here are buffs to Frost Death Knight. Why? Frost, last I checked, is doing pretty well in the meta, right? Frost is pretty powerful, so why is Obliterate buffed by 12%? Why is Frost Strike buffed by 12%? That's because the damage of Breath of Sindragosa is being nerfed by 10% as a, compensation. What Blizzard is saying, this has a very good, logical plan. It is to keep the Breath builds more or less the same. It actually looks like to be barely a 1% buff for Breath builds, but then because, of course, the builds that don't use Breath of Sindragosa only get buffed, it's a 4 to 5% damage buff for the Rider builds and the Deathbringer builds playing without Breath of Sindragosa. So this is one of the attempts of Blizzard to buff one of the underperforming talent builds of a spec, in this case Frost builds not using Breath of Sindragosa. We then have a base buff to base abilities to Feral Druid, because Rip, Rake, Rampant Ferocity, as well as Apex Predator are all being buffed. In particular, Rip, Rake and Rampant Ferocity get 10% more damage. This is of course, slightly larger buff for Feral in AoE than it is in single target because of Rampant Ferocity. Rampant Ferocity is basically the AoE splash talent you don't even take, of course, in the raid, but in your Mythic Plus builds you do take. So if you look at the damage in the raid, you get a 10% damage buff to Rip and Rake, so it's about a 2-ish, 2.2, 2.3% damage increase for your single target as Feral. When you go into Mythic Plus and you also add the fact that you do more damage with Rip because of the multi-dot you can do, as well as you do actually take the Rampant Ferocity talent, this can total out to be upwards of a 4% damage buff when it comes to Mythic Plus. You then have nerfs to Survival Hunter. Some players were confused or weirded out by the nerfs, but Survival was actually doing some very good damage. The nerfs are 15% less damage to Merciless Blow and 20% less damage to Pack Leader's Vicious Hunt. Now, this is actually pretty relevant because they have one of the strongest damage talents in the game. If you look at the damage done by Merciless Blow on average, it's over 10%. When you look at talents, you want to see them do at least 3 to 4% damage increase if you want to spend 1 point in that talent and be worth the point expenditure. Merciless Blow is currently doing 11, 12, 13% of a Survival Hunter's damage, which is far over the budget of a single talent point. So if you add the nerf to Pack Leader, only to Pack Leader, though not to Sentinel, which is what is being played in Mythic Plus, and to Merciless Blow, it's a 3-ish% damage nerf for Survival. Now you do have a pretty large set of changes for Mage. Same reasoning we talked about Frost DK. Mage is not playing or is underplaying a certain hero talent. In this case, Fire Mage is not really playing with Frostfire. Frost Mage is also not really playing with Frostfire. So Blizzard, very simply, just buffs Frostfire for both specs. Now, while for Frost, it is getting very close. The two specs are now pretty close to each other. So both Spellslinger and Frostfire are likely to become more viable. Things are a bit more decisive when it comes to Fire, because the buffs to Fire are larger for Frostfire, and as you can see here, the buffs given to Sun Fury Fire Mage, which are just the generic buffs of Fire of doing 8% more damage with Pyro, more damage with Meteor, it's about a 7-ish% damage increase. But if you take these buffs on top of the Frostfire buffs, it's over a 20% damage buff for Frostfire. The result is that now Frostfire is also ahead of Sun Fury for Fire. So basically, we can say Blizzard has achieved what they were trying to do after these buffs, making Frostfire within a 1 to 2% damage variance compared to Sun Fury for Fire and to Spellslinger for Frost Mage. So we will see now the development next reset of just in which directions the mages go after these changes. One of the largest buffs of the reset is going to go the way of Windwalker. Because the first part is the classic, okay, all Windwalkers are playing Shadowpan, let us just buff Conduit of the Celestials, which is still not going to work. Shadowpan is still going to be better. The more important set of buffs for Windwalker are the 20% damage increase to Fist of Fury, 8% damage increase to Blackout Kick, 40% damage increase to Flurry of Jouen in particular, as well as a couple of other minor buffs to Courageous Impulse and Shadowboxing Threads. This is relevant, of course, because these buffs are pretty chunky, also considering how much damage a Windwalker monk does with those abilities. Just Fist of Fury. Just Fist of Fury is about 20% of your damage. Here, it only shows up at 11-ish% more damage or so, simply because your Storm, Earth and Fire is doing the rest of your Fist of Fury damage. So just buffing that by 20% is a 4% damage increase for Windwalker. If you then add the rest of the buffs that you get along your way, it's a 5+% damage increase for Windwalker, possibly even higher, simply because Flurry of Jouen now being buffed by 40% will likely make it the better alternative and give you even more damage than what you are already taking in your Mythic Plus build, which is Hit Combo, the dual choice node with Flurry of Jouen. And after these buffs, it's likely that for Mythic Plus, for AoE, Flurry of Jouen will become better, so your damage in AoE will be even higher than this 5% buff you are getting for single target when it comes to Windwalker. We have, of course, to talk about the nerf of the day. One of the two we can say, but this is more relevant. The nerf of the day goes to Prot Paladin. Of course, is to Lysmith, the hero talent they are currently playing. So, Divine Inspiration, chance to proc armaments, is nerfed by 50%, so you're going to be chunking out free armaments half the times now with this passive. And then Divine Guidance damage nerfed by 20%, Forge's Reckoning damage reduced by 15%, and Refining Fire nerfed by 10%. The TLDR is that this is a 10% damage nerf, perhaps slightly above that. Now, what made these three passive effects feel kind of unfair was this. So you can see here, these are the three spells, the three passive effects that are being nerfed, and their damage nerfed by 10%. What is relevant about them is that all three of them happen to be completely free passive effects on top of what you are already clicking, right? You're clicking Consecration. Technically, Consecration is only barely 3% of your damage, and then on top of Consecration, you do 5 times more damage because of the free passive effect of Divine Guidance. After you put down Consecration, you're pressing Avenger's Shield, which is supposed to be doing 7-ish% of your damage. But because you get the free Refining Fire dot to spread with your Avenger Shield, you do an extra 10% more damage. And finally, you pop your wings. Wings are already supposed to be giving you more damage, right? It's a boost. It's like combustion. It's like ascendance. It's just more damage to you. Except now, because of Blessing of the Forge, you also do 12% more damage, thanks to the Forge's Reckoning extra blessed weapons giving you free damage. That was the somewhat unfair thing about Prot Paladin, the fact that all these three things weren't even part of your toolkit by default. They were just free passive effects given to you that were actually responsible, as you can see from the total damage done, responsible for almost 40% of your damage. And it was coming from completely passive effects. Now, the nerf itself, however, won't really do anything because Prot Paladin's damage was just too high already compared to other specs, so this is not actually going to amount to much. What is going to amount to slightly more is the buff given to Holy Priest, because the 2 holy words of Holy Priest are being buffed. So, at the very least, you have 25% more healing for Sanctify and Serenity. And nowadays, Holy Priest is more down the line of Serenity than Sanctify. Holy Priest has warped its playstyle around being a single target spot healing kind of build, only possible by the current overpowered and broken effect of Halo. That is how they are covering their AoE windows, and then the rest of their healing is done by using heal, flash heal, heal, flash heal, pop a Serenity, refresh your Prayer of Mending. So even without going full AoE and Sanctify not being nearly as powerful anyways, these two buffs are at least a 3 to 4% heal increase for Holy Priest, simply purely based on how much these two holy words are already healing in-game. After Priest, you have Subtlety, which is in a pretty funny situation because Blizzard is saying Deathstalker, as a hero talent, has been an underserving Subtlety compared to the alternative. So what do? They buff Deathstalker so that now Deathstalker will become the default choice for Subtlety, which will make Trickster become the underserving hero talent for Subtlety, and in about a couple of months we will see the patch notes telling us that Blizzard is buffing Trickster because it has been underserving the spec. Deathstalker is getting its plague damage, so all of the plague damage effects from the hero talent itself are buffed by 45%. So the plague damage of Deathstalker Mark is increased by 45%, the extra auto-attack damage turned into plague damage of Hunt Them Down is buffed by 45%. Singular Focus, your funnel damage, by turning your AoE damage you're doing into 5% single target damage on your marked target as plague, is increased by 45%. Your Corrupt Blood, your extra dot on your Rapture doing plague damage, is buffed by 45%. And lastly, your Shuriken Storm, after marking an enemy doing double damage as plague damage, is also buffed by 45%. On top of this, they are also buffing Black Powder, because Trickster found a way to just do AoE just fine without having to rely on Black Powder. However, Subtlety with Deathstalker doesn't really. They still want to use Black Powder, which is doing too little damage, so Black Powder is buffed by 20%. This should put Deathstalker back on the map for Subtlety compared to how little it is being played now. We could have the same discussion about Elemental, because Elemental right now is only playing Stormbringer. So now Elemental is getting Farseer buffed. You have more damage to Chain Lightning, more damage to Lava Burst, you have Latent Wisdom giving you more Ancestor damage, Routine Communication has an 8% chance to trigger instead of 5%. Currently, the first napkin math says this is useless, and Stormbringer is still going to be stronger than Farseer anyways. It is at the very least a good attempt to try to bring back Farseer after Stormbringer has completely overtaken the spec after the last changes and nerfs to Farseer and buffs to Stormbringer for Elemental. There is also, to be fair, a pretty good buff to Resto Farseer, Chain Lightning buffed by 30% and Lava Burst buffed by 15% for your Ancestors. Farseer is already doing very good AoE damage, especially on few targets. However, nobody plays Farseer. On top of that, Resto Shaman has been overtaken by Discipline Priest as the meta choice in Mythic Plus, so this won't really see much play. What will see way more play is the second nerf of the day, which is the nerf to Enhancement. So, Enhancement gets all of the Maelstrom weapon spender damage reduced by 8%. So basically, your Lightning Bolt, your Chain Lightning, your spenders of Maelstrom get nerfed by 8%. However, considering Enhancement Shaman players thought that they would have needed a 20-ish% flat AoE damage nerf to not become meta anymore in Mythic Plus, and at least a 10+% single target damage nerf to not become meta anymore in the raid, and this nerf, this 8% nerf just to your Maelstrom spenders, nets out to be a total nerf of 4%. That is not enough to change anything about Enhancement Shaman. They are still meta, they are still the strongest spec in the game, nothing really changes with this nerf, it is far too small. Then the final set of buffs, this is a defensive buff, because Arms, Colossus gets buffed 2.5% less damage taken when you play Colossus, pretty much, as well as dominance of the Colossus. So when you use Demolish, now the enemies hit by Demolish deal 10% less damage to you instead of 5. So it's another 5% damage reduction. This is okay for arms, and it would be. It possibly would be very good for protection, because, you know, it's a tank, more damage reduction, very good. Here's a problem. The tank of Warrior does not play with Colossus. They all play with Mountain Tane in Mythic Plus anyways, and this likely won't be enough to make them swap over from Mountain Tane, which already was the tankier hero talent than Colossus to begin with. Now, when you take all of these changes and you try to visualize them in how the specs are doing right now, for example, because, okay, fine, but how would this practically affect the results? Well, for example, if you take Enhancement Shaman and you give them their 4-ish% nerf, they are pretty much losing about 50,000 DPS, 50 to 60,000 DPS. So you bring their median damage from 1.35 million to 1.30. So you go and look, where is 1.30? It's about here. So that is where more or less Enhancement would be going after the nerfs. You can do the opposite. You can take the buffs instead. Windwalker, for example, is getting a decent 5% buff. If their median is 1.234 and it's a 5% or so buff, it's 60,000 more damage. So they would jump to an average of 1,294,000, which would be about here. That's where Windwalker would jump, which is pretty much the same place where Enhancement is dropping down, right? You can do the same to the other buffed specs. Feral, for example, getting a 3-ish% buff, just to show you how tight and currently how nicely balanced the damage is, in particular in the raid, with a 3% buff at 1.23 million Feral Druid, they would go up by about 37,000 more damage. So they would go up at a median of 1,270,000. So that would bring them up all the way over here, just with a 3% damage buff, getting almost half the entire chart up with 3%. Other buffs are not right now completely applicable, because, for example, Subtlety is also being buffed by 5%. However, those are buffs going the way of the hero talent that wasn't being played here, because here is Trickster. Instead, it's Deathstalker that is being buffed. Same treatment, of course, for the performance of the mages. Like, for example, the performance of Frost Mage, which is being buffed, but in Frostfire, which is not being played here. What is perhaps already more visible are the buffs already coming to Sun Fury Fire Mage, because Sun Fury is also being buffed by 7% or so damage. So they would get an 85,000 DPS buff compared to where they are right now, which would put them actually at a 1.32 million from where they are here right now, which, you know, 1.32 is basically here. That's where Mage would go up, Fire Mage would go up just playing Sun Fury, and technically Frostfire should be matching Sun Fury. So coming next reset, technically after the buffs, Fire Mage should become a top level spec performing in the raid, for example. Now these results are very volatile in the raid. Obviously, they won't be nearly as volatile when it comes to Mythic Plus, because the meta of Mythic Plus is much more strict, right? The meta of Mythic Plus, once you reach a certain level, is much harder to be able to see the performance of certain specs. This is where we are right now in week 10 with the performances of the specs. Some of these, of course, are bound to go down by quite a bit. For example, Enhancement. Enhancement in AoE, it's actually losing more damage because, of course, in AoE, Chain Lightning is also being nerfed, and Chain Lightning is a big chunk of your damage as well. So you can expect a 10-ish% damage nerf to Enhancement. So from next week, they should go in line with Elemental and in line with Assassination. You also have Survival being nerfed in Mythic Plus to their AoE dot. They apply with Butchery, so they're gonna go down as well. Some of the buffs happening in Mythic Plus will go the way of Windwalker, as we mentioned. Plus also being buffed will bring players back to play them, right? Look at the play rate of Windwalker right now, which is very, very low compared to the more popular specs. So maybe after the buff, with some of the players, some of the good players coming back to Windwalker, plus the buff, it might not even be surprising to suddenly see Windwalker around here, for example. However, as mentioned, then you still have to talk about the fact that the meta is still the meta in Mythic Plus. So even if we end next week talking about Windwalker being here, and talking about Fire Mage being here, and talking about Subtlety being here, this will still not change. In particular, this and this, even after they have been nerfed. Those nerfs are nowhere near enough to change anything about the current power level of these specs. Which leaves us to leave ourselves for this video with a sad reminder. The sad reminder is, as always, that when you buff certain specs, like we did, and you bring them up in damage, and you're like, oh, look at Farewell going from here to here, look at Windwalker going up, you know, what happens is that now your eye goes down on the other specs that were already low, and they're now about to be passed by even more specs. Because, for example, come next reset, Windwalker and Farewell and Fire will all be leapfrogging, for example, Havoc and Shadow Priest and Marksmanship Hunter, right? And that's where players, of course, will wonder after looking at the patch notes, where are the changes to Shadow Priest? Where are the changes to Marksmanship? Or where are the buffs to Havoc? Havoc has an unplayable, terrible hero talent, Aldrachi, and even in their other hero talent, Felskard, they're doing quite poorly. Why aren't they being changed? You know, not only is Devastation continuously cucked in Mythic Plus because of augmentation, they can't even do good damage in the raid. Why can't we buff them, right? That is what will get the attention also in the patch notes, not just who is getting the buffs and also who is getting the nerfs, but also who is being left out. So this is the recap for today of what is about to come in 3 or so days in the upcoming reset of 11.0.5 after going 3 full weeks without any balance tuning. We are back to getting a reasonably hefty amount of changes for this upcoming reset. So for today, as I said, I needed to be done in about 20 minutes. We are already in extra time, so we have to just stop and prepare to go out. Thanks, of course, as usual, for watching the video, guys, together with, of course, supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I forgot. I literally brought it here just to use it and drink it. Oh, it's nice that we have the light in the back so you can see the steam coming out.